views expressed by our guests are their own and do not reflect the official stance of their employer or any affiliated organizations. Welcome back to the Counsel House Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Abramoff. Today, we're speaking with Dan Margolis, who's the General Counsel of Ellington Management Group, a multi-billion-dollar investment firm known for its expertise in mortgage-backed securities and complex credit strategies. In his role, Dan operates at the center of legal, regulatory, and investment decision-making, helping guide the firm through some of the most intricate and fast-moving areas of the financial markets. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here, Dan.
So your career has taken somewhat of an unusual path, some might say. Can you walk us through your journey to how you've got to your current role?
Yeah, I think at each step, I think I took a somewhat unconventional, approach to the next job. But yeah, back in law school, I thought I wanted to be a corporate lawyer, which is, ironic given where I ended up because it was like 20 years since I came back to it. So I summered at a corporate law firm. But then didn't like it and decided to be a litigator. So I interviewed again in my third year, went to Cravath, Swain and Moore for their litigation department. Um, and that was really the first time I was introduced to the concept of being a generalist. They don't have securities litigators, IP litigators. They just have litigators, and they say, you can figure out the rest. So from there, I realized that, as a litigator, all of my colleagues in the litigation department had clerked after law school. And I didn't, and I thought that was something I really wanted to do. And kind of serendipitously, I heard through the grapevine of an opening with a judge in the Eastern District of New York, who used to be the chief judge, and he was on senior status, but fully in the wheel in the rotation. And he didn't hire clerks in the normal year and a half before schedule like most judges do. And I think, my grandfather who died at 98 used to say, he never bought ripe bananas, because you never know, like, if you're going to be there for the next year. So he would hire clerks right before the last clerk ended. So, I threw an application in. I think the competition is probably a lot less because, now you're just hiring from, people in current law firms. And I got the job, and it was wonderful. I mean, he was a great judge. I would, take him to his doctor's appointments and hang out with him after, after the trials and everything, and just a great kind of relationship with him. And during the clerkship, I saw a lot of great federal criminal trials. The AUSAs in the Eastern District are wonderful. There was one, public corruption trial where Ben Brafman was the criminal defense attorney, wonderful attorney. And I would talk to the judge about it after the trials. And, he said, look, if you want to be a litigator, like the U.S. Attorney's Office is really the best place to get litigation experience. And I said, yeah, but, those jobs usually go to people from white collar backgrounds. Like you work in a big firm doing white collar work, working under former AUSAs. And, you get that kind of big law firm white collar experience. And then the AUSAs write letters of recommendation for you. And I said, at the time, Cravath didn't do any white collar work, really. They didn't have any former AUSAs as partners. Now they do, and they've since hired some. But, so I said it, I don't think I really have a shot at it. And he said, look, at the time, the U.S. attorney was Mary Jo White. He had known Mary Jo White from when he was chief judge of the Eastern District. She was, I think, the head of the criminal division in the Eastern District. So he said, let me write you a letter of recommendation and see what happens. It can't hurt. So he wrote the letter, and I got the interview. And, right after my clerkship, I started as a federal prosecutor in Manhattan.
Oh, it's very interesting. And so do any of the cases that you worked on as a federal prosecutor particularly stand out to you?
Yeah, look, at the time I was probably 26 years old, working on some crazy big cases, right? I mean, I was flying to Dubai working on terrorist financing cases. I was flying to India working on a $600 million bank fraud,
Wow.
just wonderful cases. But I guess the one that stands out for somewhat of a silly reason is we were working on a Colombian money laundering investigation where the Colombian drug dealers were basically having people drop off bags of drug proceeds at the Diamond District, at various dealers in the Diamond District in New York City. And what they would do is they would hand over a bag of cash that, was picked up from drug deals. And the people in the Diamond District would give them gold that they would then melt down into like household objects like wrenches and then paint them silver. And then they would send them down to Colombia and declare them as like $2 items, but they were each worth like $20,000 because they were
Oh
pure
my
gold. It was
God.
a great case. So one of the people that we arrested, right, I think it was like a week before trial. He was walking to his car on 47th and 6th Avenue, the middle of Midtown, broad daylight, and he was gunned down and killed and shot. And the guy like shot him and then ran into the subway at Rockefeller Center and was never caught. And the cops investigated, and it was a crazy case. But so about a year later, I'm watching Law and Order, and sure enough, they made an episode about this case, and they got so many facts right. I mean, an incredible number of really minute details about the case that somebody, it wasn't me, but somebody had to advise them on like stuff that, I don't know how much of it was public, whatever. But anyway, there was a scene in the show where the cops, the New York City cops investigating the murder, went to the AUSA's office and asked him, was this guy cooperating against some Colombian drug dealer? Because they wanted to figure out like who they should look at. And that happened to me. Like I remember the time that the cops came to my office and said, is this guy cooperating? And of course they had a much more handsome guy playing me in the show. But it was kind of fun to watch one of my cases, on the
That's
screen.
incredible. I mean, it sounds like you probably had some other amazing cases, but that is a perfect example of a really riveting career as a prosecutor, right? And so, obviously you're looking at a really exciting environment, and you moved to a different type of exciting environment, right? So what led you to make that transition
Yeah.
from criminal prosecution to becoming a general counsel at hedge fund?
Right. It's funny. I feel like my career has been like an episode of Billions, where like half of it is like the criminal prosecutor, like from the Southern District of New York, and then half of it is about a hedge fund. And there's actually a character on Billions named Danny Margolis, which I have no idea if there's any
I
connection.
love it.
So yeah, so this is back in 2009. I was working as a partner in a large law firm doing white collar defense. I was kind of switched to the other side after being a prosecutor for a number of years. And I got a random call from a headhunter, and they said, are you interested in, potentially working at a hedge fund? And, I don't think my response was, what's a hedge fund? But it was something close to that, I haven't done a lot of work with hedge funds. I'm not quite sure what they do. And they said, well, it's okay. They know that. They just want to talk to you. And I said, well, what kind of, work do they do? And they said, well, they do mortgage-backed securities. I said, not, aside from what I read in the paper, I mean, this is right after the credit crisis, right? So 2009. So, I didn't know much about mortgage-backed securities. And they said, that's okay. Talk to them and, see how it goes. And I said, you know what? Worst case, I might get a client out of it, right? You talk to people and, can't hurt. So I spoke to them. I was just incredibly impressed right off the bat with what they were doing, and what they had built. And it just seemed like a fascinating kind of industry. And at the time I was building my practice. I was a somewhat junior partner at the firm. And it's one of these firms that you really gotta kind of eat what you kill, and spend a lot of time on marketing and spend a lot of time just meeting people and building practice. And white collar is not exactly kind of the repeat business type of thing, right? Like
Right.
you just
You
gotta
gotta be there.
putting your
Yeah.
name out there,
Yeah.
So I said, I'm gonna do it. And I think, look, I took a risk leaving the partnership. They took a risk, as a litigator, but I think they had a good idea of what they wanted. They wanted a former regulator, prosecutor who's seen a lot and can just, exercise good judgment. And look, here we are 16 years later, after the U.S. Attorney's Office, by far the best career decision that I ever made.
That sounds very fascinating, and I'm sure they got exactly what they wanted, which is, wisdom and protection, based off of your background, right? And so, looking into hedge funds myself, because I'll be honest, I am learning too, right, as many others are who are not in that space. But hedge funds often have a reputation for being secretive, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of reasons. So one, I think, is imposed upon the industry, and the other is kind of self-imposed. In terms of being imposed on the industry, there's a legal reason, there's a regulatory reason, and I'm not going to bore your listeners with the intricacies of the Investment Company Act of 1940, but basically, if a fund or if a firm wants to, invest money on behalf of investors and charge a fee, they have to register with the SEC as an investment company. And uh, there are certain restrictions though if you do that. So you can't, for example, short stocks and short securities, like bet that they're going to go down. You can't charge performance fees, so you can't charge fees based on how well you do, how much money you make for your investors. But hedge funds, and I think it started maybe back in the 60s, I'm not quite sure, said, look, we want to charge performance fees. We want to short stocks. And so under the 40 Act, they could do that if they met certain restrictions. And and some of the restrictions included not being able to advertise. So basically the SEC was like, look, if you want to do this, then you can't advertise to retail investors. You can't take retail investors. You have to, your investors have to be basically high net worth individuals, what are called accredited investors. People have a certain minimum level of sophistication, which is, seen in net worth, I guess, and institutions who have a certain amount of assets. So, from a regulatory perspective, this is why you don't see ads for hedge funds in the Wall Street Journal like you would for Fidelity and Schwab and other, mutual funds, because they're not allowed to. So that's kind of one reason that they have this, aura of secrecy, because they have to.
Right.
The other is that, there are only so many hedge fund strategies out there, right? So, strategies that can really make, outsized returns. And if a hedge fund is going to invest, often millions of dollars uh, to research a strategy and develop it, they're going to want to keep it a secret, right? They're not going to. It's like the secret formula to Coke, right? You're not
Right.
going to just
Right.
going to share it. So
Yeah.
when you combine, the regulatory aspects and the trade secret aspects, you get an industry that pretty much keeps to itself, relative
Right.
to the public. Now, of course, the SEC has full carte blanche to go in and examine hedge funds, but from a public perspective, I think that's why.
That makes perfect sense, and you are obviously competing with other hedge funds and other investments, out there, so I think that actually it helps, many people understand why that might be. So take me through what the day-to-day kinda looks like at a hedge fund. What goes on there?
Yeah, I think at a base level, every hedge fund, it's investment strategies, right? It's portfolio management, it's trading, it's, some kind of investments. But what investments uh, a given hedge fund is, focused on could vary widely. And so, uh, let's say you have a hedge fund that what they call long short equity, which basically means like betting stocks, whether stocks will go up or down, right? You could have multiple teams of analysts, poring over company data. And sometimes it's public data, right? And sometimes it's data that they're purchasing. Like, they have satellite images of, parking lots of, Walmart or Home Depot to figure out whether, how many people are going in to figure out what their earnings might be, but it has to be obviously not material non-public information, but there's a lot of ways to do this, completely legitimately. And so they're all trying to figure out, how to get better information than others and to bet on, what a stock's going to do. So that's kind of the long short equity. Then you could have another hedge fund that just focuses on, oil futures, right? And they're focusing on like geopolitical and climate risk and whether oil is going to get delivered, to a certain place, right? Completely different skill set. You could have another hedge fund that does algorithmic trading where, these kind of black box trading where you have data scientists who are poring over data and, now it's all AI, right? Having AI do back testing and figuring out what strategies work when the market ticks up 3 times and it's automatically going to go down or whatever patterns they see. And so, the skill sets at different hedge funds on the portfolio management side, they can really vary pretty significantly.
Right.
Now, all hedge funds have to have the same kind of like back office, right? Trade settlements, HR, all that kind of stuff. But if you think about, kind of the core of the hedge fund, it really is based on strategy, what they're doing.
That's interesting. I mean, it just from, obviously my perspective, which is very limited. I can imagine a team of various people who are either very good at being detectives or very good at pulling data, or maybe both, right? And so it does sound like you need a really good dream team, right, to pull it off.
Yeah.
And so now, when it comes to what you do as the general counsel, what does a hedge fund general counsel typically do?
Yeah. So I think if you look at two factors that would kind of dictate what a hedge fund GC does, the first would be kind of the number of funds they have and that they sponsor. And then the second would be the strategy, right? And by the way, it's sometimes a little complicated because when you say a hedge fund, that can mean the management company that you work at, the employer that sponsors the hedge funds, and it could also mean the hedge fund, like the vehicle that actually people invest in. So you basically you have to think about the context and to understand it. But a hedge fund can sponsor, one fund, right? In which case, you come in as a general counsel. Maybe it's the first time the fund is being formed. You form one fund, and you say every investor who wants to come in has to invest in that fund. Well, that's all the fund formation that needs to be done, right? You're kind of done with fund formation, and you could go the next 20 years just having investors come into that fund, and that's it. Another sort of style of fund is, you have one fund, but then maybe an investor comes in and says, look, I'll give you $100 million, but I don't, to invest, but I don't like the strategy of that fund. I want you to do it a little different. So I want my own fund, right? Okay. Then you form a new fund for them, right? And then another one says, well, I don't like that structure. I don't like the open-ended fund. I like closed-ended funds, and where, it's a fixed life, like private equity style, where it's like 7 years and then you get your money back. Well, now you're forming a new fund. So if you're of the hedge fund variety that has lots of different funds, you could be doing fund formation, half of your time or something, right? Or maybe, you can have a whole lawyer who just does fund formation for the fund. Um, so that's kind of one factor. And then the other factor is the strategy, right? When we talked about long short equity funds, if you're trading stocks, there's not a ton of kind of legal work that the GC is doing other than making calls about, whether something is material non-public information. But you're not drafting contracts, you're not negotiating a lot of, other than trading agreements. But, it's a lot easier to manage a lot of money in long short equity with minimal legal work. Contrast that to, say, a strategy like distressed credit, where you're making loans to companies, or, special situations like you're figuring out ways to kind of bail companies out of problems. It's all contracts, right? So you could spend your whole days just negotiating credit agreements and loan agreements. And these agreements could be 150 pages long, right? So, you know, that's why I say, like, what a GC does every day. You could put 10 hedge fund GCs in a room, and their days are probably completely different based on what strategies the hedge fund runs.
Wow. So obviously it goes far beyond just fund formation, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean,
so
also, there's also the regular stuff like HR, employment, litigation, keeping up with regulations and stuff like that. So that's,
yeah.
everybody has to do that.
And so you've obviously had a pretty different type of path to where you're at. And it sounds like general counsels in your industry typically come from your industry. Why is that? And do you feel like your group sort of took a different approach?
Yeah, I think you're right. Most GCs come out of investment management practices at large law firms. So, you're a fifth or sixth year associate, and one of your clients says, hey, we need a associate GC. They hire you out. And, the law firm is usually very happy to, have that happen, because they hopefully will get work back. And, it's kind of a cycle. But yeah, I think the reason for that is probably because most hedge funds, they have this thing called fund counsel that's identified in their documents. And that's the type of law firm that they know and they're familiar with. And that's the type of practice. Even though the reality is that the most of the work that an associate does in the investment management group is fund formation, right? Which is, like I said, it could be 10% of their time, it could be 50% of their time. And the rest of the time, if you're, like I said, if you're in distressed credit, like, you're negotiating contracts, a skill set of having come from like a corporate, loan background would probably serve you much better than a fund formation background, right? Now, I have a litigation background. I find myself, sort of recalling cases all the time when I'm doing work as a GC, right? So we have a, evaluation committee, an evaluation issue. And, I remember, like, oh, the time that I represented somebody who was under investigation for evaluation, like, what did the SEC care about in that case? I kind of bring that to thinking about, what our evaluation policy should look like, right? So, you know, I, I think people can come from all sorts of backgrounds. And now you say, okay, well, they have to be able to draft a contract. And yes, that's true. I don't think I drafted many contracts before I came to Ellington, and now I do them all the time. Kind of smaller contracts, employment agreements, NDAs, things like that. And if you're working on a large transaction, you're probably going to use outside counsel anyway. So you don't need to have, the background in, contract drafting for, the large transactions. But yeah, I think, we'll see. Look, more and more recently, more regulators and prosecutors have become GCs of hedge funds. And, I think it does make sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. And so you mentioned working with outside counsel, right? And so with the many different issues that get presented every day, how do you figure out what to focus on for yourself and what to hand off?
Yeah. So I think there's, kind of a triage that happens. For myself, like I like to, any trade related issue that's coming up like in real time, right? I'm going to work on that right away, right? Um, eh, for the larger transactions, where we just don't have the manpower, obviously we're going to go to outside counsel. Um, Most fund formation issues tend to go to outside counsel because I think investors do like to see that there is fund counsel assigned to the case, so that if there's ever any issue, they know that a lawyer reviewed the documents and the PPM, or the private placement memorandum. So I think probably my split is maybe we do half or maybe 60% in-house, and then, maybe the other 40% we use outside counsel for. But it's all, pretty much case specific.
For sure. And a typical a common conversation that comes up on this show is budgetary planning, right? So,
Sure.
I mean, obviously, all legal departments do have their budget. And how do you feel about your legal department and being kept to a budget?
Yeah. You know, we do things, I think, maybe a little differently, but I think the way we do it is right. Giving a number at the beginning of the year and saying, here, stick to this and tell me, how you compared at the end of the year, I don't think answers the right question, right? Because uh, maybe there are some companies out there that the legal work is very similar year over year. Maybe if you're like a widget company or a licensing company and you're entering into the same number of agreements, and you could say, like, I spent $1 million last year. This year, I was able to do it for 950,000. But certainly at a hedge fund of any size, the legal work varies significantly year to year, right? So one year we might be forming, two funds. Another year, we might not form any. One year we might be involved in an M&A transaction. Another year, not. Um, so at the beginning of the year, you kind of don't know where you're going to end up. So what we do instead is we say, look, at the end of every year, I give a report to our executive committee, and I said, here's how much money we spent. Here's how we spent it, and we go into a lot of detail of to the maybe rounding off to $1,000 something, but like, here are the 20 transactions and how much we spent on each one, so that our principals can see, okay, that's how much that transaction cost. Did we get good benefit from that amount of spend, right? We go into metrics of, which law firms we used. Did we use different law firms from last year? How did our numbers, relate to prior years, just so we can see kind of what a rolling average looks like. But again, like I said, like, I don't think that's the most important number. I always tell the principals that if the number is less than the average for the past five, like, don't give me any credit. And if it's more, don't blame me. What they should be looking at, and I think they do appreciate this, is did they get, a good, efficient use of legal resources that benefited, the business units, right? And so, I think that's a better question to ask to figure out whether you're getting a good, use out of your legal resources.
I think you're absolutely right. Because look, I mean, obviously, it is no matter what industry you're in, legal work is unforeseeable. So there's no way to forecast that. But it sounds like you're giving them amazing data as well, because it shows them on their investments, are they getting the return they need? Is this type of investment going to attract more legal issues? So I think actually that type of practice is probably more valuable than most people even understand, right?
Yeah, I know. I totally agree.
So, looking at the important attributes of a successful general counsel, whether at a hedge fund or otherwise, what are some of these areas that you think are most important?
Yeah, look, I think with any regulated industry, the most important thing is to stay safe, right? Make sure the company doesn't run afoul of any legal or regulatory issues. Um, After that, what you're trying to do is make sure that the contracts that they enter into are as protective as possible for the company, without negatively impacting the business imperatives of the company. So if you take too long to negotiate a contract, or you keep going back and forth over nitpicky issues, and the other side just kind of walked away and went to someone else because it was taking too long, you've lost, right? So there is always that balance. Also, communication is absolutely important, right? You're going to be pulled in 10 different directions from 10 different people at the firm who all want your time, and they all think that what they're working on is the most important. You're not going to be able to work on everything at once. So you just got to communicate and make sure you understand what the real deadlines are, and give them regular updates about, where you are with their work. And that, could become hard. I mean, for me as general counsel, like we have several associate GCs, on the team. We also have outside counsel. So, when I have to give somebody an update of what's happening, it's like really pulling information from multiple sources, right? Especially when you're using outside counsel, you're beholden to their schedules, and they might, the people that you're working with might have some, crazy, important deadline that they have to meet. So you got to kind of manage that. But it is really important to make sure that people know that you're on the case, you're taking their work seriously, and you're going to get to it, and tell them when. Um, Overall, I think you just got to know what's going on at the firm, and understand the legal issues that impact the firm, and where problems might arise. Because if problems arise, they're going to ask where the lawyers were, and you're the lawyer, so you better know.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Those are all great pieces of advice for attorneys that want to get into that space, and just in general, I think it's very relatable across the board with what makes a great attorney and hopefully eventual general counsel for those who are listening.